The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very honoured to stand with my colleagues from the New Democratic Party tonight to talk about the need for this inquiry for the murdered and missing women, and to thank my honourable colleague from Abitibi Bay, James Inuvic, EU, who's been such a passionate speaker on this. I point out, Mr. Speaker, that it took a procedural manoeuvre to get a discussion on the number of murdered and missing Indigenous women in this country from a government that has done everything they can to stonewall this discussion. This is September. It's a time when we talk about going back to school and we think of our young people. And I think of 16-year-old Maisie Ojek and 17-year-old Shannon Alexander 6 years ago, walked out of their home in Kittigan-Zibi and were never seen again. Never seen again. Now, they weren't like the Conservatives who are talking about these people who are unemployed and criminal records and living on the streets. They were top students. They were Army cadets. They walked out of their home. They weren't runaways. They didn't take their wallets with them, and they were never seen again. Now, I ask you to imagine Oshawa, London, Ontario, Kamloops, two young white students going missing. Imagine the media. Imagine the articles. Imagine the mass outcry from the Canadian population that two young leaders could be stolen right out from their street. But that didn't happen, did it? In fact, I don't ever remember hearing a single story about Maisie or Shannon, and I didn't learn about it till a year later when I saw their family members putting posters up on the streets in little towns in Northern Ontario. And I went up to that poster and I said, so this is what it's like to have justice if you're an Indigenous young woman in this country. That your family has to go out and put up posters to say what happened to our daughters. So what would an inquiry tell us? Well, an inquiry would tell us, how is it possible that two top young students were taken away and there was no national plan to make the public aware that it was left to people putting up posters on the streets? We've talked a bit about young Tina Fontaine, whose body was found in the Red River. What hasn't really been pointed out, the police weren't looking for Tina Fontaine. They found her accidentally, wrapped up in a garbage bag. And Sergeant John O'Donovan of the Winnipeg Police said what I think every parent in this country should feel. He said, she's a child, this child has been murdered. Society would be horrified if we found a litter of kittens or pups in the rivers in this condition. She was just a child. And again, we have to ask ourselves, how is it that a police officer would have to point out that if it had been dogs or kittens who had been treated to such abuse, there would be outcry? And yet, it was a young Indigenous woman. And contrary to my friends in the Conservative Party who say, you know, it's family members who do these things, and it's people they know, and it's people with criminal records, Tina Fontaine was taken from her family because the federal government will not pay for support for children who have needs. She was a happy, loving child. That's how they remember her. And when her father died, she was taken away through Children's Aid. And the reason they took her away, Mr. Speaker, is why they take our children from communities across this country, is because this federal government won't pay for the basic supports that any other child, any non-Aboriginal child in this country takes for granted. When we have a child who may be possibly suicidal in our region, they're taken and apprehended because the federal government believes that providing suicide therapy for teenagers is not a justifiable expense for their money. So they'll leave the child to either die in the community, or if the children's welfare become aware of it, often the only choice they have is apprehension. And what we see with apprehension is children are taken from their families, they're taken from their cultures, and all too often they end up on the street. So what would an inquiry tell us? Well, an inquiry would start to unpack this horrific statistics of the young people who end up being trafficked, and the young people who are living on the streets because they were taken from their homes because basic support for counseling and therapy and family at home support is not available. But you know what? It's available to any non-Indigenous child in this country. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it that in a country like Canada, we have a system of systemic discrimination that if you're a child on reserve, you just make do. And so what would an inquiry tell us? Well, an inquiry would unpack a whole manner of things, because these are very complex issues. We'd begin to see, okay, perhaps there's vulnerable women who were murdered on the Trail of Tears. And why were they vulnerable? And why was it possible that women were taken without police investigations, finding out who the perpetrators were? So we could unpack that part. And we could unpack the part about the young children who are being taken, the young women who are taken from their homes because the federal government will not allow therapy and in-house support for their families. And so they're put into foster care, and like Tina Fontaine, they end up on the street. We could start to make answers there. We could begin to look, Mr. Speaker, that if you look across every city in this country, the Trail of Tears runs through the downtown of it. From marginalized women who are considered disposable, a disposable class of human beings. I think of this past May, Mother's Day, when the mothers in the Anishinaabe Nation came down on Mother's Day to bang the drum, to beat the drum, to ask why the Justice Minister, Mr. Stand Up for the Victims, refused to meet the mothers and the sisters and the daughters. What would an inquiry tell us, Mr. Speaker? Inquiry would send a message that these women were loved and that they're respected, and that our Canadian society is ashamed that so many people could be allowed to disappear or die, and that we wouldn't have to have a Justice Minister who hides in the House of Commons while the mothers and the sisters and daughters stood out there on Mother's Day and just asked to meet, to tell their stories. Because a part of the showing of respect, Mr. Speaker, is that you allow the families and the victims to be heard. You don't write them off with the statistics, oh, well, half of them must have been killed by their relatives. You know, some of the others may not have had jobs. That's what we hear from the Conservatives. We'll get an action plan billboard to say we've responded. We'll put that action plan on the Trail of Tears and see what difference it makes. An inquiry, Mr. Speaker, is about a societal commitment to make change. And we know the Conservatives are ridiculing this. They've been trying to suppress this. But I point to Ipperwash. What did the Ipperwash inquiry do, Mr. Speaker? At Ipperwash, we saw how the Conservative government of Mike Harris told the OPP to go in and take those Indians out of the park. That's what he said. And young Dudley George died. But another life was ruined that day as well. It was the OPP officer who followed the instructions that was given to him by the government, and he went in and did the shooting. And what the Ipperwash inquiry told us was that things had to change. And you can see it, and I will tell this. I can testify from the many, many events that I've been in my region and across this country that when I deal with police officers, they fundamentally changed their approach to dealing with peaceful confrontation because of the Ipperwash inquiry. So lessons can be learned. But, Mr. Speaker, it's about respect. It's about recognizing the fact that in 2014, the standard that we can think that it's okay in a country as rich as Canada to say to children that they don't have the right to safe schools, that they don't have a right to proper homes, that they don't have a right to the basic supports that any other child in this country takes for granted simply on the basis of their race. That has to end. Will an inquiry solve all these issues? No, Mr. Speaker. But it'll send a message that the healing needs to begin, that the path of reconciliation needs to begin, that the country that has broken the treaty from the beginning has to recognize that we are still in this relationship together, and this relationship has to change because it is the primary relationship on which this country has been built. Thank you.